Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and our cinematic universe is dying. More and more of them outside of the MCU seem to be falling apart. In fact, the only one that's on total stable legs at the moment is the MCU. Pretty much ever since the first Avengers movie, Marvel's really hit something that no other film studio has ever hit before. The ability to publish like 3 of these movies a year, and each one of them not only being successful, but many of them being record-breaking. This year alone, Marvel kicked butt with Black Panther and Infinity War alone, both of which were wildly successful. And since that time, pretty much every single other film studio has tried to duplicate on their success, using their own intellectual properties to try and expand into something on a level comparable with the MCU. However, none of them have shown much success. The most obvious candidate for this should be Warner Brothers, since they have a whole comic book universe to explore. And more than that, it wasn't split in half the way Marvel was for the majority of the MCU up until now. DC has control over all their characters, yet they can't seem to put together a cinematic universe to save their lives. The reasons for which are well documented at this point, and thoroughly discussed on this channel and many others throughout YouTube and beyond. Well, a series of problems ranging from a lack of quality control across their movies to a series of poor decisions regarding what order their cinematic universe was published in. DC rushed to the gate with stuff like Batman v Superman and Justice League and paid dearly for that. The fact that those 2 movies alone didn't each make $1 billion, and yes, that's a pretty crazy standard to say, but the fact that something like Infinity War can make the kind of money that Justice League apparently can't is insane. Batman and Superman are huge names in the world, far beyond stuff like what Captain America and Iron Man were, let alone the Guardians of the Galaxy before they were, given the spotlight through their movies. The fact that DC has been able to capitalize on the likeness of Batman and Superman speaks volumes to how far behind they are as a cinematic universe. And things have only gotten worse since then. While Aquaman and Wonder Woman 1984 look super promising, DC has a lot of weird plans that don't seem tied to the cinematic universe, like that standalone Joker movie that apparently is going full steam ahead, along with some other Joker movie that Warner Brothers has announced but hasn't talked about much recently. I have no idea what the plan is, what they're doing. It all seems so desperate at this point. Aside from the immediate future with the Wonder Woman sequel and Aquaman, both of which look cool and have promising directors behind them, and obviously Patty Jenkins has a lot going for her since she did a great job with the first Wonder Woman movie, everything else seems very questionable at this point, and has me wonder how much DC is intent on doing a full cinematic universe at this point. If they are, they're all but guaranteed to have to go towards Flashpoint to sort of half reboot their franchise, only keeping the stuff that's working, which is pretty much just Wonder Woman and potentially Aquaman at this point. The whole thing is a mess, and each DCEU movie that comes out makes less money than the one before it, which is not a good sign whatsoever. So we'll see what happens, but it is all definitely worth being a bit of a concern, to say the least. Warner Brothers is in a very tight place right now, and I don't know what their plan is going forward. Yet, they're doing relatively well compared to some of the other attempts at cinematic universes out there. Fox had something pretty good going for them, but that is effectively dismantled at this moment. Though it's not like Marvel's just going to give up on the X-Men or Deadpool or anything like that. They aren't going to go the same route that Fox originally was at this point. That's all but guaranteed. We're still likely to see a Deadpool 3 at some point, and sooner or later Marvel is going to release that New Mutants and X-Men Phoenix movie that has already basically been filmed at this point, because there's no sense in just shelving that for no reason. Those are pretty much completed movies, so there's no good reason not to use them at some point or another, even if Marvel has future plans for the X-Men beyond what's set up there. It would make more sense for them to simply film some extra scenes and tinker with those stories ever so slightly, rather than abandon the movies entirely after having all this footage sitting on hand. That's a huge waste of time and money, and that's pointless. Disney spent $1 billion on these properties. They're gonna make use of them here and there, and the first thing they should do is publish the movies they already have on hand. It just makes sense. And let's not forget Sony, whose attempts to make the Spider-Man series of movies into a cinematic universe went so bad that they basically had to surrender the character to the MCU. And now they're attempting to do the same thing with a Spider-Man cinematic universe without Spider-Man, which is even more insane and weird. And we'll see how that goes with Venom this year, but I have voiced my skepticism about all of that before. That opinion hasn't changed much, even with some more promotional material and new trailers coming out. I'm still super dubious about that whole affair. Especially given that they've already failed at creating a cinematic universe out of the Ghostbusters thing, and really put the cart before the horse with that one in a big way. It's so crazy to think about how they had like a whole plan for different takes of Ghostbusters movies, and then that awkward, horrible Paul Feig comedy came out. And everyone's kind of forgotten about the whole thing by now. I haven't heard anyone mention the Ghostbusters remake in like over a year at this point. It's kind of crazy how badly these companies are doing so far. And then we have the Dark Universe, or whatever they were calling it, with all the classic monsters in those movies. That has only been published as The Mummy so far, and it's pretty clear nothing else is going to happen. And that's already after another false start with Dracula Untold, something I know nothing about, but in either case hasn't won over the audience in any big way. So Universal is really lagging behind in creating any meaningful universe along those lines either. There is the Monsterverse, with Godzilla and King Kong both being pretty successful entries into their cinematic universe so far, but it's not comparable to the MCU. They're only making movies once every few years, it seems. Though I have enjoyed what they've gotten so far, it'll be interesting to see what they have planned for all of that going forward. Star Wars, another Disney property, is also attempted to make a cinematic universe, and to be honest, it's not going great. Though the first few entries did really well commercially, and more or less were entertaining pieces in and of themselves, though each of them have had their own problems, Solo really underperformed at the box office, largely due to Disney's own self-sabotaging aspects of their marketing and when they chose to release that movie, coupled with a lot of production issues with the movie basically having to be shot and filmed twice. It's maddening. The whole thing is insane, and it's unclear where Disney plans to go forward with the Star Wars movies, but it seems they've abandoned their idea of making any standalone movies, and they're just going to focus on the third part of their trilogy, and then probably going into Rian Johnson doing his own trilogy. That's fine, but nothing compared to the cinematic universe of Marvel. And I think part of the problem of that is Star Wars can't really be quite as multi-genre as the MCU can. Each of the MCU movies have their similarities, but they also have differences to them that give them their own distinct flavors and tone to each movie that sells you on the specific property at hand rather than the entire brand as a whole each time. So Black Panther can strike its own tone and go in its own direction without having to worry about what you're going to think of Infinity War. They barely set that stuff up, to be honest, aside from a small cameo by Winter Soldier at the end. Because Marvel doesn't need to worry about that stuff. You get excited about Infinity War because you know you're going to be returning to Wakanda, or seeing the Avengers again, or seeing the Guardians in the Galaxy in action and crossing over with the other MCU characters. It sells itself at this point, to the extent that Marvel barely has to market these things at all. Like, they do put out their ad campaigns and stuff like that, but their own hype is by far their biggest asset at this point. None of these other cinematic universes, not even Disney's own Star Wars, has that same level of near universal acclaim at this point. Yeah, there's always going to be the hot take community that's going to be down on certain aspects of the MCU or whatever, but who cares? Because look at the numbers that Disney's pulling with the MCU movies at this point. They speak for themselves. The audience has spoken, and they love the MCU. And I am with them on this. Those movies are fun, and there's no reason for us to feel bad or apologize for enjoying those movies for what they are. The fact that pretty much every other universe and franchise has been unable to keep up with the level of quality control that Kevin Feige has managed to maintain over time, that's on them. And it's probably because they don't have someone like Feige in the room. I understand that a lot of the Marvel Studios' current modus operandi is basically Feige and a bunch of his friends who are all just comic book nerds like us sitting around in a room and making decisions about the MCU based entirely on the cool stuff that they want to see. And that shows every single time. All these other studios and franchises that have been attempted, from Bond to the Monsterverse to even some of the smaller things that have really had a slow start, like the whole Power Rangers idea, or Hasbro tinkering around with making Transformers into a cinematic universe, they are so much more calculated behind everything they do. Everything is just an attempt to duplicate what Marvel does. The reality is, it's been a good idea for Warner Brothers and companies like that to try and do something different. Their problem is that they're so cynical and afraid of their own shadow that they don't quite commit to that idea. They don't go far enough in a different direction from the MCU, and instead kind of try to be like the MCU while also simultaneously trying to be something different. And the end result is stuff like the Justice League, which is just a total and complete mess. And if we're being honest, a failure in every regard, commercially, critically, even just from the perspective of a fan of the Justice League, it failed, and it failed really hard. It has its moments, but it tries to be two movies at once, and it is an abomination because of it. But that goes for The Mummy as well, and several other properties along these lines. They try to set too much up, they try to dive headfirst and be the MCU all at once, forgetting that this has been slowly built up since like 2008 or however long we've been going at this point. I know it's been like 10 years and it's hard to even believe that, but the MCU took its time. Those Phase 1 movies were a little rough, a little cheap, a little small in comparison to the crazy stuff we get out of the solo movies now. That's because the MCU knows how to ramp up, they know how to deal with shifting standards, and better than any of these other cinematic universes, they know how to compete with themselves and with all these other companies. They just sort of keep plowing forward, keep tinkering with things, dealing with some of their criticisms. Like, look at how good their villains are now. In the last year or so, we've gotten some of the best comic book movie villains out of the MCU. That used to be one of their biggest problems. They've gotten a lot of criticisms about their humor and some of their other less quality aspects of their filmmaking that become kind of predictable. So they've gotten better at that. I find the humor is less predictable these days, and it's a lot funnier, just in terms of raw joke quality out of the MCU movies lately. Which is good, because it doesn't get stale that way. So, I don't know if there's an easy solution. Well, there kind of is. You really just need to put somebody in charge who isn't some business executive, but is either a writer or a fan of this franchise who understands that fan service is different from a quality thing that cares about the media property at hand. The MCU isn't afraid of doing things different they're not afraid of doing things that, the fan community might not be 100% on board with, because usually those differences pay off. So we don't get exactly what we got out of the original Infinity War comic event. We get something better, and that's kind of cool. Trying to challenge the source material, using the fact that you're adapting it to make these things better or different, that's very clever and a solid aspect of the MCU. In comparison, Warner Brothers does try and do some stuff different, but they're so afraid of their own shadow that they keep walking things back, and their whole attempt at deconstructing the superhero genre really wasn't a good idea for Zack Snyder. In fact, the whole idea of hiring that guy to begin with, that's old hat Hollywood right there for you. They picked someone who was cool and relevant decades ago, instead of someone who would challenge what we think of a blockbuster, like James Gunn. That's a whole separate issue. We're not going to get into his firing into this video, but he was a good example of doing things differently while also understanding that he's part of a bigger brand. And look, it hasn't always worked out for the MCU for this reason. Edgar Wright had to leave the company probably because he wasn't fully on board with what they were doing. But Marvel weathered that storm and turned Ant-Man into a successful franchise just the same. That first Ant-Man movie is way better than it had any business being given what happened behind the scenes, but it worked, and it worked well. A lot of these other companies could learn from that, and they need to take chances on better directors, I guess. Here and there, some of those other companies have taken those appropriate risks and sought out the same sort of indie directors that the MCU has sought out before, but sometimes it doesn't work. It feels like a lot of the time it's because they meddle in the wrong way. While the MCU largely meddles in order to keep a certain level of quality intact, it seems like companies such as Warner Brothers actively hamper their own attempts at making a cinematic universe, diving headfirst into the most immediate, top-of-the-shelf things that are, in their eyes, guaranteed successes. So we get a movie with Batman and Superman in the title right away because they know that'll sell. We get a Joker movie because they know that name has a lot of recognition, although I don't think Warner Brothers quite knows what they're in for in that regard. Because traction matters. The fact that the Joker is so overplayed is going to have an effect on that movie, and I don't think they fully understand this. I don't think they get the fact that media isn't consumed in a vacuum, that people have played the Arkham games before, and I don't think a lot of people out there are that excited to see a Joker solo movie. I'm not, especially given Warner Brothers' track record at this point. And yes, when we get something promising, like a cool new director doing the Aquaman movie this year, it makes me hopeful they can turn it around. Anyways, I think that's, I didn't really have a plan for this. I just feel as though it's not working, and the whole studio system is shifting right now. It's unclear how much Disney plans on bullying movie theaters and what the long-term solution is for a lot of these film theaters. I'm getting kind of tired of the movie experience. It's a weird thing right now. The idea of having 2 or 3 hours, maybe with your friends, to sit in a dark room and watch a movie is kind of stale at this point. These things were conceived of at a time when there weren't home television, and it wasn't in high definition. There wasn't such thing as home surround sound. We have all of that now. And more than that, when we're watching movies at home or with friends at their house, we can talk, we can socialize, we don't have to pay 100% attention to what's going on the screen. It can be more of a social activity. And more importantly, if it's boring or weird, we can do stuff while the movie's playing. I don't like to just sit and watch something anymore. It's kind of boring. So I think it's telling that these cinematic universes aren't working beyond the one company that's managing to keep them fresh and sincere every time. I don't know what's going to happen to the whole film studio business at this point. The changing market with the whole global box office having much more of an effect on the decisions film studios make has already come into play a lot of times, and it's unclear why these other companies can't make a cinematic universe work. It's one of the few things that should play well across the world, the idea of Batman and Superman being a thing. But the global box office market seems to largely track with how things work in America too these days. The stuff that works, like the MCU movies, like Jurassic World, they play well overseas as much as they do domestically. The stuff that hasn't worked as well, your Suicide Squad, even stuff like Warcraft, which did well globally but not enough, isn't carrying these franchises. And I think it kind of has to do with how they go about these things. Look at how much Iron Man set up the MCU and compare it to all these other supposed starts to cinematic universes we've got over the years. Iron Man doesn't do much. It mostly focuses on its story with one little tiny scene at the end setting things up. And that's all it took. That was all that was required of this first movie. And then stuff like Power Rangers or all the other false starts that we've mentioned, they're trying so hard and they're so desperate, so of course it doesn't work. But just the same, that's just my opinion. Feel free to share yours in the comments section below. And thanks for watching. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.